And welcome back, everyone. We're ready to begin with the top 8 of the MXP 20K from Los Angeles.
Yeah, pretty exciting top 8. We've seen a bunch of different decks do well, but Nadu very much the dominant deck going into top 8. And interested to see whether gonna take it down, whether decks that are kind of more prepared for Nadu will end up prevailing. I guess we'll find out soon enough.
Yeah, and we're about ready to go to our match. We've got Gabriel Bostic on Jeskai Control against Richard Neal on Bant Nadu, and it looks like our players are shuffling up.
Yeah, and
So,
this is, excellent example of that Nadu versus deck that beats Nadu here, whereas Jeskai Control very much made to beat up on Nadu. We see a bunch of main deck Wrath of the Skies from Gabriel, but more just sideboard hate for Nadu, just a bunch of interaction kind of lined up to be as good as possible in this matchup. And so interested to see whether they can take Nadu down this match.
absolutely. And if you're on Gabriel's seat, what do you want to see against Nadu? You mentioned Wrath of the Skies. What else do you have?
Well, really, I want Wrath of the card I want most is Wrath of the Skies. The card I want second most is my second copy of Wrath of the Skies. The card I want third most is probably my third copy of Wrath of the Skies. That's a very far and away the strongest card in this matchup. Very much what you're leading on against Nadu. Beyond that, it's just a matter of just some interaction plus card advantage. So one ring kind of crucial to this Jeskai deck's game plan. You probably want to see that at some point, have some early interaction, some galvanic discharges, prismatic endings also very much wouldn't be amiss, would help this deck kind of deal with whatever's left over if you do get that board wipe, and maybe interact 1-for-1 if you don't see that board wipe early.
And it looks like Rich Neal's off to a start that is a bit faster, has the turn 1 delighted halfling. And looking at list, Rich's list is a bit more optimized for speed as opposed to grindiness, with no one rings in the main deck and a noble hierarch as an additional mana dork.
Yeah, we see Noble Hierarch, I believe 0 copies of Arboreal Grazer, definitely 0 copies of Malevolent Rumble, kind of the tools that let the deck go a little longer, be a little less softer removal. And that, I think, is very much in Gabriel's favor here, where they have the softness of the deck interaction versus resiliency means that they only really need to answer the combo and combo pieces a few times rather than over and over and over again over the course of the game as the deck sets up turn over turn. So definitely a list against which Gabriel can maybe answer the first few threats and then maybe get a little breathing room to cast a one ring rather than worrying about threats of combo turn over turn.
And that turn 1 galvanic discharge, turn 2 galvanic discharge ends with the halfling slowing Richard down, and Richard does have a Springheart and Shuko in play, but that's not really a threat yet. And without a Shuko, a Nadu on turn 3 wouldn't really do much by itself. So Gabriel's set up to be perfectly fine here.
Yeah, the Nantuko does generate a bunch of recurrent card advantage in the forms of the token it generates, which can pressure the Jeskai control deck, maybe force an early wrath. So ideally for Gabriel, they would have been able to answer the Nadu, answer the Springheart Nantuko more permanently than bouncing it with Teferi. But this works. This will kind of do for now. At least there's not an Nantuko actively on board. Richard's going to have to respend his mana to deploy it and maybe to try and generate something of a board presence. But yeah, Gabriel very much would like to find a permanent answer to that Nantuko. Otherwise, it's going to force a board wipe at some point or threaten the critical mass that Nadu can use to easily combo.
If you're Gabriel, what do you want to be playing this turn? What is your ideal thing to set you ahead and solidify your lead?
Some sort of cheap interaction for the Nantuko while having another answer in hand would be ideal. The Jeskai control deck as a whole really wants to be playing out the one ring in a spot like this, but unfortunately for Gabriel, this is very much not a safe spot to tap out for that. Nadu off the top, Nadu plus Shuko out of Richard could very much end the game. So I think in this spot, you really want to be doing something like galvanic discharging that Springheart Nantuko if possible, and then in some other way, having a second answer for another threat.
And it looks like Gabriel does have that One Ring that you mentioned, but doesn't have an untapped land for it. So even if they wanted to, it wouldn't be an option. But they do have the
Yeah,
Discharge that you called out.
notably, there's Discharge, and I believe there's a Force of Negation and Dress Down as other answers in hand. So very much could see Discharge taking care of something else getting answered, either directly or indirectly. And then, yeah, maybe next turn, the One Ring getting tapped out for, particularly with that Force of Negation as backup, so that Nadu itself is a threat, but Shuko can be counted. Something like a Chord for Nadu can also be counted.
Yeah, and Richard's hand is fine, but overall a bit underwhelming. There's another Spring Heart and Shuko, and there is the Shuko, but
Yeah,
it isn't as proactive.
it's a little clunky, but there is another Nantuko to keep applying pressure. There isn't a clean answer to that from Gabriel, and notably, if the Shuko gets through Force of Negation, there's also not a clean way to answer a combo piece in hand. So I actually really like forcing that Shuko, even though it seems like a terrible trade, because this means Richard's going to need 2 more combo pieces next turn to be able to counter, to be able to combo, and that makes it safer to maybe run out the One Ring and get that card advantage going.
I absolutely agree. Like putting yourself in a spot where you don't have an answer to just a resolved Nadu, and just having to dress down to buy a turn seems a bit counterproductive. So I
Yeah.
appreciate Gabriel just putting themselves in a good spot.
Yeah, in this spot, they really, really need to get that card advantage going. They're running out of cards. The 1-for-1 answers aren't really working out for them. They need to find that Wrath of the Skies that we kept talking about that lets them gain more of lets them gain a larger scale advantage, set the Nadu deck back further. And so, really, what you want to do is set yourself up to tap out for the One Ring. And Gabriel did exactly that. And at this point, they just gotta hope that Richard doesn't have another Shuko plus a way of putting Nadu into play. And I believe we know that he doesn't have that.
Yeah, so what does Gabriel want once they have the One Ring in play?
At this point, it's Wrath of the Skies almost. It's very much the most impactful card. There's a lot of material on the board, and so answering it 1-for-1 isn't super reliable and is unlikely to cut it, particularly given this One Ring is going to cost you some more life. So Gabriel really wants to find a board wipe to deal with the critical mass of bodies Richard has put together, because without something like that, it's pretty easy for the Nadu deck to just assemble threat turn over turn with things like God of Calling for Nadu, God of Calling for Outrider, just many, many ways to apply enough pressure that Gabriel's not going to be able to answer it to prevent the Nadu deck from comboing with 1-for-1 interaction.
It looks like there still isn't a Wrath of the Skies from Gabriel, so they're going to have to try and stall for a bit more time until they can find it.
Yeah, Teferi plus Counterspell is nice. This forces whatever piece of whatever Richard's gonna play in this spot out at once. So if there were a card of calling, you'd get to Teferi bounce whatever's coming off that card. I believe we know there isn't a card. I believe it's just an endurance in hand. But yeah, make sure that in this spot there is not a threat that's going to end the game immediately at end of turn untap with another one. So whatever's here gets to get answered, and then Counterspell gets to answer whatever threat is presented next turn. So at the very least, it seems like Gabriel's going to get another turn.
Yeah, but how many more turns do you think they're going to have? Richard's got a really wide board at this point, and with at least 4 power coming through afterwards and a ring on 2, that's a fast clock.
Yeah, I imagine we'll see one go at the Teferi this turn, another 3 at face. So definitely a lot of pressure on Gabriel to find a board wipe. It is worth noting, we know Gabriel has another ring in hand, and they have a bunch of energy in play. So if they find a Wrath of the Skies, they could just go 2 mana, wipe the board, play another ring, reset my ring, and they're pretty close to golden. But we're not there yet, so need to still find that Wrath of the Skies.
And drawing that Shuko off the top means that the Summoner's Pact in hand lets Richard Neal start to combo. And
yeah, I believe this is actually just game. And this is exactly the problem we talked about, right? Where if you're playing against the Nadu deck, at some point you need to find a Wrath of the Skies. Otherwise, critical mass is going to be in the Nadu deck and just present threats and combos over and over. So Gabriel kind of an awkward spot where they need to hope that Richard didn't have two combo pieces, but or didn't have a combo piece and then drew a second, and Richard had a combo piece and then drew the second. That was game. One of the risks of doing something like countering an endurance in Gabriel's spot, where they could have held the counterspell and it looks like that would have been better for them and they would have prevented the combo. But in a spot like that, again, you're in this really tight squeeze with the amount of material this Nadu deck generates, where if that endurance doesn't get countered instead from Gabriel, they're under a lot of pressure and likely a 2-turn clock, and their hand really isn't set up to win through that. So I think they had to counter the endurance, and that kind of highlights the strength of this Nadu deck and the strength of Spring Hut and Antuko specifically into your opponent planning to 1-for-1 you a bunch.
Yeah, and Antuko being able to just generate a full board by itself just takes over games as a one-card fair plan for these matchups. And
yeah, I think cards like Nanduka really highlight the importance of Wrath of the Skies and ways of dealing with multiple permanents at once rather than just relying on 1-for-1 removal. When Nadu deck in general is really good against just 1-for-1 removal, with Nadu itself also being really resilient thanks to its ability getting you a card back, and Urza Saga also generating multiple threats.
Now, I've been hearing you talk about the card Wrath of the Skies a bunch. Do you think that Gabriel's going to bring in the copy of Wrath from their sideboard into the main deck for this post-board game?
I'm gonna hazard a guess and say yes. Yeah, very much the thing you most want in this matchup. The one card that most clearly comes in for Gabriel. I could see Supreme Verdict come in. It's a lot weaker because it doesn't deal with Shuko and Urza Sagas, but some number of removal that isn't 1-for-1 is really nice. Brotherhood's End could also help on that. It's a little awkward though that it doesn't answer Nadu itself. So yeah, beyond the one Wrath of the Skies, the answers in Gabriel's sideboard a little less perfectly lined up in this matchup, a little more awkward.
I've seen some players talk about bringing surgical extraction from Jeskai against Nadu. Do you think that's reasonable, or do you think it should be stick to just saving it for Flages?
It's tempting. The problem is that post board, the Nadu deck also has like a decent fair plan, better than game one. We saw the fair beatdown like threaten lethal this game, and post board we get to see that even more with Titania as something you can back for or card for. There just is a 1 or 2 turn clock on its own with the number of fetch lands this deck has and Sylvan Safekeeper. So I'm not super thrilled to bring in surgical extraction. You really need to have a critical mass of answers, and as we saw that game, every card in your hand that's not an answer is kind of a liability. So a little awkward to bring in, and not always going to be something you can hit Nadu with, where sometimes you just don't get rid of a Nadu early. Sometimes the Nadu that kills you is actually the first Nadu your opponent presents the whole game. And so not a huge fan of bringing in surgical, but I could see doing it if there's enough other clunky cards that Gabriel wants to get out of that deck.
You've mentioned Titania as a card that the Nadu deck can bring in to fight these grinder games. What other tools does Richard have available to himself?
The other big piece is 2 copies of the One Ring. So yeah, you can basically what the deck wants to do post board is do kind of the same thing we saw it do that game one, where it applies a bunch of scrappy pressure, and then in addition to the combo, just has these haymakers that carry the game on their own. And so you just present more haymaker threats than your opponent on control can answer. So yeah, Titania does that, and the One Ring definitely does that, where it allows the Bant Nadu deck such a critical mass of cards that the Jeskai deck can't keep up, all while applying pressure to your Jeskai opponent, so that they can't leverage their One Rings as well. Definitely a matchup where you're leaning on the sideboard cards, and given the specific list, I'd imagine this actually gets better for Richard post-board, where it seems like he's getting more out of the sideboard than Gabriel is.
It looks like Richard Neal put back a hand with the Veil of Summer, Spell Pierce, and 5 lands. Apparently not enough creatures or cards actually do anything for him.
Yeah, one of the downsides about post board with decks like these is you kind of need to draw the right mix of cards. And so, like an awkward fact about bringing in things like Spell Pierce and Veil of Summer is you do also need threats that they can back up in the first place. But that said, I mean, extremely strong cards, so definitely bringing them in. It just means the deck maybe mulligans a little more awkwardly.
And it looks like Gabriel's keeping a 7. I don't think we got a good look at that, but excited to see what it is. And this
Yeah,
6 looks. How do you feel about it?
it's pretty decent. The Delighted Halfling on one's really nice. Protecting your big Haymaker threats from counter magic is nice. Something like the One Ring could be huge. We're seeing Gabriel thinking about this. I think they may be considering even subtletying this just because of how brutal it is against counterspells. Uh, Particularly protecting a protected One Ring is really, really hard for this Jeskai control deck to beat, with no answers in hand for Gabriel. But at the end of the day, I don't think you can afford to 2-for-1 yourself this early in the game, particularly when there's no guaranteed answer to the Delighted Halfling next turn.
That makes a lot of sense. And looks like Gabriel's just holding a land saying go. I believe they have a dress down in hand that could be used if they really want to.
Yeah, there's also subtlety for if there had been a Nadu. Notably, subtlety puts a spell on top of its controller's deck rather than countering it. So one of the few ways you can answer a Nadu that has mana paid by Delighted Halfling in this deck.
That's an important thing to be aware of. And Richard Neal's just developing with a wall of roots, creating a board, and be able to just have more mana for future turns.
Yeah, and things are going actually surprisingly well for Gabriel here, where they kind of have everything they need set up with the Wrath of the Skies in hand to make sure that there's not going to be to make sure that they're going to be able to answer this going wide from Richard, while at the same time not being forced to expend any resources trading 1-for-1 with Richard's threats.
Yeah, and this is the type of hand where without the Springheart and Go, we're just not able to get multiple threats out of one card. So Gabriel's better at being able to just take their time and sit back with all of the answers in hand.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked to see something like a dress down at Gabriel's next end step on on Richard's upkeep. Either of those functionally the same. Just something to buy another turn, force Richard to spend another turn doing nothing and playing towards that Wrath of the Skies getting a large board wipe.
And this is a chord for 3 using the wall twice for Chord of Calling. Does this always just get Nadu?
Well, in this case, it's definitely not getting anything unless it gets a Flage.
And I don't know what, and I believe that means it counters instead of being copied.
Yeah, I don't know whether Gabriel declared odds or evens, but it looks like there's nothing being searched for there. So it looks like they lost a flip, and it's a bear cancel. But yeah, very swingy card in this matchup, and you'd think that as a counter spell, not the strong as a control deck, Gabriel's deck would not be the strongest at leveraging a Chord of Calling for 3, but Flage in their deck means actually they have a really good Haymaker to get. So if that invert polarity was successful, would probably have won, or would have at least threatened to win them the game, and makes it a pretty strong card post board in this matchup. So I'd expect to see, I believe there's an extra copy of it in the sideboard, and I would expect to see that coming in to go with the one in the main deck. Also, because at the end of the day, this is a matchup in which you frequently just want cancel. You want to be able to answer your opponent's Haymaker threats and kind of ignore their chaff, like Gabriel is doing in this game.
And Richard just took a turn and completely just passed back to Gabriel. What sort of stuff do you think he has in hand? Is it just more Chords of Calling?
Yeah, I have to imagine more chord is what you're representing here. But pretty awkward spot with Wrath for 3. Well, there's not something I think Richard can chord for here that doesn't. Yeah, notably Could
Is
him
there no
attack
Sun
with the
Cleanser?
halfling? Oh yeah, Sun Cleanser would do it. I have to imagine that's actually stayed in post spot. That's a really good shot. So that could get rid of Gabriel's energy, make sure they don't get any energy from this Wrath of the Skies, and now that has to be answered before the bot can be wiped again. That said, that is yet another card that's not getting a combo piece, so it's not that bad for Gabriel.
And Richard's hand is a bit awkward right now with it being a Beseiju that doesn't really have targets, a Titania with not very many, no fetches in the bin to actually get back. And what does he want right now?
Well, a fetch would be pretty good, and that is exactly what he drew, so.
Yeah, it just represents getting, well, 2 5/3s on the board. And do you
Yeah.
think that just the beatdown is what Richard wants right now?
Yeah, definitely. Particularly given Sun Cleanser means future Wraths of the Skies are turned off till it gets answered. I have to imagine Richard just wants to try and put a bunch of 5/3s in hand. I believe we know Gabriel has a subtlety that's going to buy at least a turn against the Titania.
Yeah, and that subtlety is going to be really huge for Gabriel, just giving them time. And how many cards does Gabriel have in hand? Do we know?
Uh, I'm not entirely sure. I know there's a Flage, a Subtlety, and a Force of Negation in there. I'm not sure what else they have in hand.
And we're just waiting to see what happens. Richard Neal, see what he surveils. Putting a breeding pool into the graveyard. And casting the Titania. Does it get subtletied?
I think the question here is whether you want to spend 2 cards to subtlety it, or just accept playing a fair game against it, with Flage lining up pretty well into the 5/3 stat line wise. Oh, there's a One Ring, not a Flage. Interesting.
Oh, the red and white art is a bit difficult to tell apart. I think with One Ring, does that make it better to subtlety the Titania?
Yeah, I think in that spot, subtlety is pretty tempting. I think the only reason to not go for it is to hope to wipe the board in 2 turns, and in that case just play out the One Ring and hold up the subtlety for a combo piece. But given that there's a Sun Cleanser in play, wiping the board is pretty difficult. I guess it depends on whether Gabriel brought in those copies of Brotherhood's Ends, and that's Supreme Verdict. So, while while it might look like a simple decision to us, it's pretty complicated for Gabriel because they'll know what they actually brought in this matchup and what are their outs if they let this Titania resolve.
And they're really thinking about it. It looks like they are committing to playing the subtlety. And what they pitch is also a huge decision because both Dress Down and Voice of Negation matter after One Ring comes down.
Yeah, it's a question of whether you're more worried about something like yet another Nadu, something whether you worry about something like Nadu, or one of the things like One Ring or Court of Calling that threats that Richard could present that could end the game. Notably, Dress Down, not the strongest against Titania. It does technically answer Titania in terms of preventing a fetch land from being replayed, but there's still that Waterlog Grove in play that's going to let the Titania continue to generate value. So, not really that much point to Dress Downing it. Much better to just go for trying to find a board wipe and have that be your answer.
Oh, and Gabriel got the second subtlety. That's huge for them. That buys another entire turn.
Yeah, second subtlety is back-breaking here, I imagine. Because we know Richard Neal's not going to be able to present combo next turn. And now that the One Ring's on 2, it's so easy to just out 1-for-1 this deck.
And this Flage is a nice top deck. It doesn't kill the Sun Cleanser, but it can deal with one of the mana dorks and can start to just come in and pick down the Titania and the 5/3 elementals that she comes with.
Oh, and I believe that's a copy of Minamo in play. So that One Ring's getting activated twice this turn.
Oh, and that's even more brutal with 5 entire cards drawn from the One Ring.
Yeah, and now with board wipes in hand, Flage in hand, this game's looking pretty over. Notably, Flage can't deal with Sun Cleanser this turn. It could deal with Sun Cleanser next turn by just getting cast and then escaped all in one turn to deal 6 damage to it. But also with the Supreme Verdict in hand, I have a hard time imagining that matters at all.
Yeah, and Gabriel's choosing to play the second One Ring, getting protection for a turn. I think they're trying to just make sure that the Titania gets got by the Verdict.
Yeah, at this point, you know there's a Titania coming. You know there's not a threat of comboing out, so this is as good a time as any to reset your One Ring, make sure you don't take too much damage. And yeah, Titania mostly doesn't matter here. It is worth noting that Richard could fetch for a Dryad Arbor in response to Supreme Verdict, and I believe that will give him a 5/3 after Supreme Verdict happens, since it's going to be a land that's going to the graveyard off it.
I believe it doesn't actually. Dies is able to look forwards in time when they die at the same time, but looking for something put into the graveyard from the battlefield doesn't actually trigger Titania. I believe there's an exception to the rules for the word dies.
Yeah, that's an interesting interaction. I wasn't aware of that was how it works. But
Yeah,
either way, Richard not particularly excited to put a land to lose yet another land here, where he kind of needs a bunch of mana to get back into this. So not sure that he's particularly likely to want to fetch that Dryad Arbor anyway.
and it looks like he's choosing to float a green mana with Wall of Fruits. I wonder if he's going to use it for anything.
I have to imagine it's getting used to crack that Waterlog Grove, hopefully taking advantage of this turn where Gabriel's tap low to try and combo off, like we saw last game. I don't actually know whether Gabriel even has anything in hand that can help with the potential combo turn, since we saw them spell multiple subtleties and a force of negation.
I see a Rending Volley as a 1-mana way to get rid of a Nadu. So
Yeah, and
it looks like they have some.
yeah, bringing that in really heads up play from Gabriel, where it's one of those cards that doesn't seem like it's at its strongest since it literally only answers Nadu, but recognizing that efficiently answering Nadu is so important in this matchup, and being able to answer Sun Cleanser for 1 mana is so important in this matchup, that even if it's a blank a lot of the time, it's worth having a copy in your deck for that specific reason, particularly because the deck gets to look at a lot of cards with things like the One Ring, so one-off much more likely to matter here than it might in other places.
Yeah, and it looks like Richard Neal's really just trying to set up. He has the Haywire Might as an answer to the One Ring at least. So maybe he can get rid of Gabriel's card advantage engine and try and fight a game.
Yeah, the problem is how many cards Gabriel has in hand, and the fact that there's this Minamo in play. So if you try and answer the One Ring, Gabriel can activate it again, draw another 3 cards, and I don't think there's really any coming back from that for Richard Neal.
Yeah, especially when Gabriel has the Flage in hand.
So yeah, at this point, there's enough mana used. Richard's not threatening to combo. I would not be surprised at all to see the Minamo activated on the One Ring. Oh, well, Counterspell on the Haywire Might does it too.
Oh, and Veil of Summer to protect the Haywire Might.
Yeah, Veil is nice here for sure, but there's just so many cards in hand for Gabriel that I doubt that this is going to cut it.
And excelling the One Ring at least, but still with 6 cards in hand and one of them being a Flage, Gabriel has a lot of pressure.
Yeah, and I wonder whether Gabriel this turn maybe actually tries to answer that Wall of Roots with Flage and a flashback, or maybe with a Galvanic Discharge. Just some way of making sure that there's not enough material on the board for Richard Neal to really combo, and then that leaves Gabriel in the spot where they can just try and take over the game and tap down a lot more safely, knowing holding up a single answer is going to be enough to prevent Richard Neal from winning. Notably, there are 2 mono blue lands between that Minamo and Island for Gabriel, so that means that if Flage was cast and flashed back, there would only be blue mana left up. So maybe not the ideal turn for that.
Yeah, and no Mystic Gate or equivalent in play for Gabriel means that the mana base does have a bit of awkwardness, for sure.
Yeah, but that said, given the plethora of answers in hand, I have a hard time imagining Richard Neal coming back from this. The game seems pretty over.
Yeah, Richard's only sitting at 2 cards in hand, and Gabriel just has so many answers. Like, the writing is a bit on the wall.
Yeah. I wonder. It's just a matter of when Gabriel feels safe enough to tap down and try and close out the game here. And I imagine next turn will be that turn when they can cast a Flage and still have mana left over for 2, maybe 3 answers. If
Yeah,
there isn't some better card advantage source or threat to run out than Flage even in a spot like this.
and Galvanic Discharge answer just the halfling just shows that they have it all. Like, just knowing that even if they run out Flage, they're just going to target face with it and say, hey, I can kill you in 2 turns with this.
Yeah. Definitely heads up play for them, recognizing the discharge in hand is worth less than the damage to Richard's face. I don't believe there's an Arena of Glory in play to make the Flage attack this turn, but there notably is a copy in Gabriel's deck.
Yes, and that's important for closing out games. And that's the One Ring from Richard Neal, one of the only cards that could actually get him out of this spot. If not the only
Yeah, and
card that could.
one of the downsides of us having seen that counterspell used early on Haywire is a spot like this where there are threats that are more haymakers, but Gabriel knows that they're so far ahead, this One Ring doesn't matter because they're just gonna have this One Ring will draw a bunch of cards, and there's no answer for the One Ring from Gabriel, but all those individual cards can actually be very easily answered. There's Rending Volley, there's a Flage on board, so you can just kill Nadu, Springheart, Nantuko, whatever Richard Neal puts into play, and then it doesn't really matter that there's a One Ring in play because they will just be dead to the Flage.
Yeah, and with the Flage in play, the life loss from the One Ring will actually start to matter because they'll just be able to point a face over and over again. It doesn't matter if Richard Neal has blockers; he'll just be taking 5, 6, 7 damage per turn.
Yeah. Notably, I believe there's a second copy of Flage in Gabriel's hand. So they really have this locked up in terms of lethal damage. They can just answer whatever the blocker is here. They have 3 pieces of interaction for that, and then Flage plus the One Ring trigger is likely to kill Richard Neal.
Yeah, and I believe if you kill a creature in response to the bestow ability, the creature still resolves as a creature, right?
Yes, that is correct.
So, not able to get the 2 for 1, but still answering the Wall of Roots. Richard's just going to be left with a Springheart and Tuco, probably a token from it as well, but that probably doesn't stack up.
Yeah, so I believe we'll see Flage cost, kill one of the tokens, attack with Flage, kill the Nantuko, hit Richard for 6, and then get back one of the Flages from the graveyard to deal the last 3 points of damage.
Is there
We
that
could
much?
also just see triple Flage trigger all at face, not bother with the blockers entirely, where Gabriel can hit face with Flage, cast another Flage, hit face, and then escape that same Flage again, hit face again. That's 9 points for lethal.
Yeah, it looks like they're just trying to kill Richard directly, and Richard scoops it up. We're going to be going to game 3. And when they were shuffling through their deck, I noticed that Gabriel did bring in a surgical extraction. Do you think that the players are going to make any changes to their deck on the play on the draw?
I wouldn't look to see large changes. Maybe a little more focus on interaction that's more efficient from Gabriel, things like surgical extraction, maybe slightly more likely to hit the cutting board. But really, post board, the matchup is a lot about efficient interaction. So wouldn't look to see that many changes.
And it looks like we have a result from the other match. The winner of this match will be playing Paul Green, who's third seed on Bant Nadu, who just beat Tilford Lead on Moto Energy.
Yeah, so one way or another, we're going to be seeing some Nadu in the semifinals. It'll be interesting to see if Gabriel does manage to take the stand, or whether they can how the list stacks up against an even better prepared Nadu list. We talked about Richard Neal's list being more prepared for a faster meta, focusing on speed rather than resiliency, and being really, really good at putting the combo into play quickly. Whereas Paul Green's Nadu list, I believe, has Malevolent Rumbles, has Arboreal Grazer, so a little more ready for interaction. So kind of interested to see which of those flavors of Nadu ends up stacking up a little better.
And for this game 3, just want to see both players have like good starts and see how they stack up against each other.
Yeah, it's pretty tough for the Bant Nadu deck in terms of good starts, where the Nadu deck really wants to see the Jeskai deck struggle. If the Jeskai deck has like kind of the perfect start of interaction in the first few turns, of like the right types to line up against what the Bant Nadu deck is doing, followed by Wrath of the Skies, it's pretty hard for Nadu to beat that. But yeah, one of the ways the deck can struggle is there's a lot of different types of interaction. We saw Surgical Extraction, we saw Rending Volley, we see stuff like Force of Negation and Subtlety. All of these things only line up very well against certain specific threats. So the way the Nadu deck wins and gets ahead early is either the interaction just not being there for Gabriel, or just the interaction not lining up well against the threats that Richard is presenting, letting him maybe get a little more value off those threats, or just forcing Gabriel to 2-for-1 themselves to actually answer some of those things.
Looking at the hand that Gabriel's drawn, seems to have a lot of good answers with the Wrath of the Skies, Rending Volley, and Galvanic Discharge, but doesn't have any threats or card advantage. Does he
Yeah,
appealing to you, or is it just too one-dimensional?
It's close. The card advantage more so than threats is what's really important, and I believe the Rending Volley, if that is one, I can't quite tell from the art, is a slightly more one-dimensional answer, even among your answers, where it's only really good against Nadu and Sun Cleanser. But that said, Rending Volley plus Wrath of the Skies means you have a board wipe through interaction from Richard, and I think that's pretty hard to put back. So I have to imagine Gabriel almost always keeps this and just hopes to draw one ring at some point to actually turn that early interaction into a victory.
And it looks like Richard is going down to 6. Didn't find the opening 7 very impressive. See if he can get something better right now. And Nadu, Halfling, Lands, and Sun Cleanser. This seems very good for him. We can present an uncounterable Nadu on turn 2, and has a Sun Cleanser to answer Wrath of the Skies. This seems about a Shuko away from ideal.
Yeah, this is pretty much perfect, but like we talked about earlier, this matchup very much about the interaction the Jeskai deck has rather than the threats that the Nadu deck has, where the interaction needs to line up poorly against a threat for Nadu to kind of get ahead early. And unfortunately for Richard Neal, the interaction in Gabriel's hand lines up kind of perfectly for this. Where there's a Galvanic Discharge for the Halfling, Rending Volley for the Sun Cleanser, and then a Wrath of the Skies to just clean up whatever's left after. So I think in Gabriel's spot, they're pretty well set up. They just need to draw more threats over the next couple of turns, and maybe another answer to a source of card advantage, because Nadu particularly could be problematic as a threat that can't easily be 1-for-1.
Yeah, and one thing Gabriel has that can at least help them get a bit of card advantage is they've drawn all 3 of their Surveil lands. So they can at least dig towards their cards that matter. And card selection is still incredibly important when you need to make sure your answers line up correctly.
Yeah, that's nice for Gabriel, but a little awkward the way it taxes their mana. Notably, we talked about answers lining up perfectly, and we might actually see that happen here, where the Rending Volley might be forced to go after a Nadu that gets put out early, and then the Nadu, and then the Sun Cleanser can kind of keep Gabriel off the other answers in the form of Wrath of the Skies and Lightning.
And this 3 fairy from Richard Neal is really problematic because by upping it to 5 loyalty, Galvanic Discharge can't kill it, and now Richard will have a window to just do whatever he wants. And if Gabriel doesn't use the Galvanic Discharge on the halfling, if he has drawn the Shuko in the last couple turns, Richard might be able to combo just from this.
Yeah, notably, only one copy of Teferi in Richard Neal's deck, so there's not really a way Gabriel could have known to play around it, but definitely tough in a spot like this.
And if you're Gabriel here, what do you want to draw to get out of this spot?
I think it's very much about what Gabriel wants for Richard Neal to draw on this spot, where you really want that draw to be a little clunky, not kill you anytime soon, so that you can actually get value off that Wrath of the Skies. Beyond that, some way to answer Teferi would be nice. I believe there's a prismatic ending in their deck. I believe that's the one out. But short of that, this is looking like a pretty tough spot.
And the counterspell that they've just drawn is a very dead draw, since Teferi doesn't let them cast it at all.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons Teferi is such a problem, right? Well, it's not even that much of a threat right now. It's not doing that much, but against Gabriel's current hand. But as the game progresses, there are more and more dead draws for Gabriel. There's subtleties, there's force negations, there's counterspells, invert polarities. There's so many cards in the deck are completely turned off by Teferi, and there's not an easy way to one-for-one answer it. So you kind of just gotta hope Richard Neal cannot present a lethal threat at any point.
One interesting thing is that Gabriel should be able to, if they discard this Lorien Revealed, they will have enough cards in graveyard to escape the Flage they surveilled earlier. And if they do that, maybe that can be enough of a threat to actually answer the Teferi and let them actually play Magic.
Yeah, there's definitely a line back into this. The problem is there's that Sun Cleanser to turn off Wrath of the Skies, and there's a Sun Cleanser to turn off Wrath of the Skies and also turn off Galvanic Discharge. I keep wanting to call that card Harness Lightning. And on top of that, the Teferi's at 7 loyalties. So even if Flage comes back here, Teferi could just downtick, bounce the Flage, and then be safe and force Gabriel to spend even more time redeploying that Flage without a way to escape it, and just kind of give Richard Neal infinite time and space to set up for a longer game. All he really needs to do is find one threat.
Yeah, and it looks like Richard is a Nadu away from going off with the Outrider in hand as a way to just target his things for free.
Yeah, notably with no Spring Hunt and Nantuko in play, Nadu plus Outrider isn't nearly a deterministic combo, but it definitely does give Richard a really good chance, and I would imagine that he is still very favored to win the turn this turn if he gets Nadu down, and at the very least will go up 12 cards at the minimum, which is really hard for Gabriel to have a beat.
Yeah, and even if in those 12 cards there's like a Court of Calling or just anything of substance, that can be converted into a win so easily.
Yeah, so game looks pretty close to over if there's a Nadu drawn, or indeed another threat in that vein. But if there's still no threat drawn, if it's just air for a couple of turns for Richard Neal, we could see Gabriel getting back into this game. We could see them maybe slowly whittling away at Richard's resources and getting to a point where things like Counterspell are turned back online and can maybe help them actually wrest control of the board again. Something like a Titania or a One Ring would also be kind of interesting here, where it would let Richard apply some pressure, but unlike Nadu, pressure alone not necessarily going to be enough to win this game. Where Flage can maybe keep up with that for a little bit and let Gabriel maybe play a more on-board game a little better. It's really Nadu specifically that ends the game.
Yeah, and one thing is Richard does have Shifting Woodlands in play with 2 card types in graveyard. So once the Teferi gets answered, Richard will be tantalizingly close to just turning the Woodland into the Nadu that got answered earlier this game.
Yeah, it's very true. It's hard to tell what the lands are on this spot, but yeah, Woodlands turning into Nadu, yet another way this game could end pretty quickly.
Yeah, and we'll see if Richard places that by developing the Outrider or chooses to play around a Supreme Verdict and hold it in hand. And is this representing a Court of Calling?
Yeah, I like the choice of playing around the board wipe you saw last game. Just making sure that you don't fall too far behind on board and are set up for a combo with something like Nadu. Being a type away from activating that Woodlands is still quite meaningful, and I think is a reason to play towards the good draw and play around kind of the backbreaking play here.
Yeah, and the counterspell used for the cord.
Yeah,
Richard
I
choosing.
didn't see the card in hand. How many types does that make? Because there's
That's 4.
land, creature, instant, planeswalker. I think that's 4 types.
That is the
So if
4th
there's
type.
another land, in hand for Richard Neal, that could be Outrider, activate the Shifting Woodlands, and that should be game.
Yeah, so there needs to be a land in hand or on the top. And Richard Neal, there's a lot of ways he could just win this game right here, right now.
Yeah, Nadu on top also does it. I don't think a card on top does it.
And Richard thinking about the decision, wondering if he wants to keep it on top or not.
This is really good heads up play from Richard with what looks like a confusing play, right? You could have just Teferied you could have discarded while the Teferi out on you could have just gone with Teferi out on his turn, but instead chose to wait until end of turn to play around a board wipe of some sort, which I quite like. I think that's probably the only way you really lose this game in this spot. That or failing to draw a land or Nadu. But I think playing around the board wipe is better because even if there isn't a land on Nadu drawn here, we're just kind of just going to get yet another chance to do the same thing next turn.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see what he has. Presumably it's another chord, and it is. Just forcing Gabriel to have the answer, and it does get force negation. But Rich is just presenting lethal on it, threatening lethal on every turn. That's a Dried Arbor, which is an awkward draw.
Notably the one land that's not going to help in a spot like this. But yeah, I also believe Gabriel's dealing with nothing in hand, where there's a Wrath of the Skies in hand that has no text. And they really, really need to just find some way of answering something here. Otherwise, next turn, that's going to be lethal.
And this one draw really matters. And that's... Didn't quite get a good look at it. Looks like another Wrath of the Skies.
Yeah, and that's not gonna cut it.
Oh,
Oh
it's
wait, is
actually
that a surgical
surgical. Oh,
extraction?
that's perfect. And when is surgical being cast? It appears to be on Gabriel's turn. So this means
Yeah,
that the
we could
threat of
see,
combo is not
depending
present
on
anymore.
timing, we could see a woodland activation in response. Oh, it looks like the surgical's already resolving.
Yeah, and this is huge for Gabriel with no threat of combo and a Flage in the bin. This is just Richard needs to find a Titania, and even that might not be enough because the Flage is so close to just coming back and dealing with the 5/3s.
Yeah, I think at this point the game's looking really rough for Richard. One of the advantages of surgical is specifically spots like this where the only spot of dying is combo. Uh, yeah, Richard's out's now drastically removed because even One Ring isn't really doing that much. It's just drawing Richard a bunch of cards, but he needs to find his one off Titania to actually win the game.
And just from that, we went from a spot where Richard just killed by untapping to just not having anything going on.
Yeah, I wonder if we'll see a rat at some point just to clear this Dryad Arbor with with no energy, and and get another card in the bin for Flage.
Oh, that's with 3 cards in bin for Flage. That makes sense. And I wonder if there's nothing else. Just clearing the arbor, making sure that one more card in bin represents a Flage.
Yeah. Woodlands, I believe, becomes a 4/4 copy of something in the graveyard, so this is a pretty quick clock.
It just becomes a copy of a permanent. The
Oh,
stats do not change.
sorry, it's hard to remember all the changes it went through in development. uh,
And is it becoming a Dryad Arbor? A 1/2 halfling? It's got 1 power regardless. And Gabriel's taking 5.
yeah, Arid Mesa, a surprisingly good draw there because it lets Gabriel get back that Flage. And yeah, things are looking pretty tough for Richard.
If, does the Flage just target the Delighted Halfling here? Outrider's ability actually having text here means that if you target it, just redirects the damage to the Sun Cleanser.
Yeah, I will admit to not having read the text on Outrider Anchor beyond target creature very much. The rest of the text not something that frequently comes up. But yeah, I believe the Flage has to take down the Delighted Halfling as a result.
Yeah, and that's just Gabriel's very stable at the moment. And the game looks pretty much over.
Yeah, I could see Richard drawing a One Ring being the one thing that gets him out of this, since Gabriel has very little. Oh, there's a Force of Negation in hand. I missed that. So yeah, pretty much not really a way for Richard to come back here, where where even with the stuff he has in hand, Titania just loses the heads up against Flage pretty badly, and
That,
so pretty tough for him to get back into this.
and then Richard Neal drew the Endurance 1 turn too late. And it's just sitting there mocking him. If it had been there earlier, he could have answered the Flage and stayed ahead, but now he's still got nothing going on.
Yeah,
He will have
you
6
can
power to block the Flage.
triple block the Flage, yeah. Uh, I wouldn't be shocked to see that happen here,
Yeah, and
but there's just no resources for him at that point. The Sun Cleanser finally gets dealt with. There's really not a lot going on for him if both the Endurance getting answered, and that Flage will still be in graveyard, so it's just going to be a matter of time before Gabriel gets it back.
Well, it would be 6 power attacking every turn, which is real. But
Yeah,
yeah, it's
definitely helps. It's just really hard to race Flage with something like with just regular creatures if the Endurance doesn't get cast.
yeah, the endurance. I would be
If
surprised
they
if Richard has a way to win other than triple blocking.
Mhm. And if the Endurance triple blocks, I'd expect to see the Sun Cleanser killed with combat damage, and then Wrath of the Skies clearing up the rest of the board
Right.
to make sure Gabriel just doesn't have very much going on. Sorry, Richard
Yeah.
doesn't have very much going on. So Gabriel doesn't either, so there's still a few turns where Richard has something, but yeah, that inevitability from Flage really hard to beat.
And it looks like damage is being done to the Sun Cleanser first, which checks out.
The question
And
is how much we see the Wrath of the Skies for. The choice for Gabriel is whether they want to bank more energy or leave up mana for Force of Negation. But yeah, I like this line, leaving up Force of Negation again. I think the One Ring is kind of the one card Gabriel could lose to, and Force of Negation is a uniquely good answer against that, where it counters it and doesn't even get into the graveyard. So Shiftling Woodlands is not copying it and threatening card advantage later.
yeah, and Richard's just reduced to swinging for 3, turning the woodland into a copy of Endurance. And Gabriel just wants this to keep going, where Richard's not presenting real threats, and they can just draw cards to eventually go into their graveyard to fuel the Flage.
There's still 4 copies of the One Ring. I'd say that's what Gabriel is most looking for at this point. Just finding those copies to be able to like actually end the game, close out the game with card advantage. But honestly, anything that puts a bunch of cards in their graveyard also just leaves them in decent shape. I wouldn't be shocked to even see the subtlety chump block before too long, just to get closer to Flage.
Yeah, I actually really like the attacks with the Salty because Gabriel's winning the race, and if you force Richard to hold the woodland back on defense, you're just buying yourself more time to just get the Nadu going. Not
Yeah,
the Nadu going, sorry, the Flage going.
yeah, it's definitely not at the point where you want to be chump blocking with subtlety. That's only if things come if there's if the at a later point with Richard presenting more pressure, we might see something like that.
But this is just
Yeah, just having the subtlety and the woodland stare at each other also pretty good for Gabriel. 9 life, pretty convenient life total for Richard to be at. That's 1 Flage attack plus trigger.
And one thing I've noticed is that we haven't seen a single Urza Saga from Richard Neal post-board. Is it possible that he boarded them out because of fear of Wrath of the Skies hitting them?
Yeah, I could see the other sagas either having come out or, at the very least, having been trimmed in quantity for fear of Wrath of the Skies. Uh, Definitely like a backbreaking wrath that kills early creatures, plus lands, one of the easiest ways for Richard to lose this matchup.
Yeah, but it's coming to be a bit problematic for him here, where the constructs might have been a way to victory, but very much aren't right now.
Yeah, and this game looking pretty over. I don't believe there's outs for Richard at this point, given the Force of Negation we know is in Gabriel's hand.
Yeah, this One Ring's getting answered. Exactly, Titania would threaten one turn lethal, but there isn't a Titania, so Fritz is just on his last legs.
And we're at the point where subtlety is threatening lethal. We're 2 cards away from The Flage coming back, so we'll be at a point where if there's another card that goes to Gabriel's graveyard, that subtlety is threatening lethal just by attacking, even if there is a blocker for it, or it gets removed because again, it being the card to go to the graveyard would put Gabriel to 5, and then they're one card away from Flage. So yeah, just kind of over a bunch of different ways for Richard in this spot. I have a hard time imagining him coming back.
Yeah, even if he somehow stabilizes, the Flage will be lethal, and I don't think there's anything that can happen.
Yeah, notably just one copy of Endurance in his deck, so I don't believe that's an out to answer the Subtlety and the Flage at once.
And there is an Otawara.
And not exactly where you want to be. Auto-warrowing the Subtlety while you're in top deck mode, giving your opponent an answer to whatever your next threat might be. So really just delaying the inevitable here.
Yeah, it doesn't. Stalling for time won't actually do anything, unfortunately, for Richard, so this is just delaying the inevitable.
Yeah, that's 5 cards now for Flage. About to be 6 if something somehow happens to the Subtlety. And yeah, that's gotta be game.
Yeah, and Richard scoops it up. Gabriel Bostic will be advancing to the quarterfinals. No, to the semifinals.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked about how they're going to be up against more Nadu in the semis. Again, Nadu deck that's maybe more prepared for these longer interactive matches. So interested to see how that pans out, whether their deck ends up quite cutting it there.
Yeah, so after this, we're just going to jump to top 4. This last match took over an hour, and it was an absolute slog between these two decks. So in the other quarterfinals matches, Edward Drew beat Alexander Soderberg, and Robert Cedar beat John Wong.
I believe one of those was Nadu Mira, so we're going to see another Nadu deck in the semifinals, and I'm not sure whether we're watching Dimir Control or Jeskai, whether we're watching Jeskai Control or Dimir Murktide. It looks like it's Jeskai versus Nadu in both.
Yeah, both of our matches are Jeskai Control versus Bant Nadu, so more slogs like this one are what's coming up.
Yeah, interested to see how those pan out with these Nadu decks that are left at this one, maybe being slightly better prepared for Jeskai, and whether Jeskai can continue to beat up on Nadu then.
Yeah, and we'll catch you after this break to show you the top 4 matches. See you then.